Happy New Year! It's the week ending Friday the 10th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen wildfires decimating Los Angeles, with thousands evacuated from their homes, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigning after 9 years in power, and the death of far-right French politician Jean-Marie Le Pen at the age of 96. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Rebecca Messina and Harriet Marsden, and we also welcome back journalist and campaigner Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Now, Donald Trump has said this week that he wants Greenland, so I thought I'd kick off by asking, if you could conquer any country, what would it be, Rebecca?
Thanks for coming to me first. I think I've got Italian citizenship now, so I think Italy, because it'd be easy for me to sort of get a foothold in there.
You're already halfway there. You're abusing their bureaucratic process. Harriet, have you secretly wanted ownership of another nation?
Oh, I think it's got to be Spain. I would take Spain in a heartbeat.
You've both strategically made choices that are close to the land in which you live. Elizabeth, I wonder whether you've maybe got your eyes on somewhere on the other side of the planet.
No, I'm now declaring war on Harriet because Spain is mine. You cannot have it.
Oh, this is going to get interesting.
Yep.
I'll take Gibraltar. Right. Oh, someone already has. Rebecca, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, as of this week, there are no longer enough inmates at Guantanamo Bay to stage a football match.
People left in Guantanamo are the worst of the worst, the hardest cases. And Joe Biden, as you said, released them for nothing. They're going to the exact same place and the exact same program where Obama released 30 Guantanamo detainees in his final 2 years. And what happened to them? 29 of them went back to their home countries, Yemen and Afghanistan, with no accounting for their whereabouts. For all we know, they're back in the fight, threatening Americans. Yet another step for Joe Biden to add to his sorry legacy of coddling America's enemies and endangering our people.
Senator Tom Cotton speaking to Fox News on Wednesday. Rebecca, what's happened this week?
So this week, 11 Yemeni detainees from Guantanamo were transferred to Oman, which leaves just 15 prisoners still at the complex. It was interesting because this was sort of a 3-year project, as you can imagine. Transferring Guantanamo detainees to other countries is quite a complicated business. But it got to the point where in October 2023, everything had been agreed. The inmates were told to prepare for departure. A plane was actually on the tarmac at Guantanamo. But then the Hamas attacks happened in Israel, which caused the US to put the plan on pause. It's now been resumed. So they've gone to Oman. We're not going to be told the details of exactly what's going to be happening to them there, but apparently they will be found somewhere to live, a job. Oman even plans to help them find arranged marriages. And after 2 years, they will be able to leave Oman, but I think we can imagine they will be quite closely monitored by the US for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, although you said, so they're Yemeni, but they're going to Oman. Why are they going to Oman and not Yemen?
Yeah, so this is something that's sort of slowed down the release of the final Guantanamo inmates, is that some of them come from countries that aren't deemed suitable for transfer, not just for their own safety, in fact, not so much for their own safety, but because of the difficulties it could create for the US to monitor them. Countries considered unstable, like Libya, Yemen, the Palestinian territories, but also countries like China. China's not considered suitable precisely because not only would the detainees from there who are part of the Muslim Uyghur minority, not only would they be subject to potential torture or execution there, but also, obviously, China's not going to be very forthcoming in allowing the US to monitor their activity. So the 22 Chinese citizens who were previously imprisoned at Guantanamo have ended up in places like El Salvador, Bermuda, Slovakia, Switzerland. Several of them went to the Pacific island of Palau.
Right. And you mentioned there'll now be fewer people than there would be in a football team. Just give us a very quick reminder of Guantanamo Bay. Where is it? Who's been imprisoned there? How many people have there been in the past? And why does it exist? I'm sure everyone remembers it came about after 9/11. But just give us a very quick overview.
Yeah, it opened in January 2002, and at its peak in 2003, it held 680 detainees, 90% of whom were never charged with a crime, and obviously the vast majority of whom have since been transferred. It's on the US Guantanamo Bay naval base in Cuba. This is kind of key to how the way it operated, because the Bush administration didn't consider the people that it was apprehending prisoners of war. They weren't subject to the protections of the Geneva Convention, and because they weren't US citizens and the site it isn't technically on US soil, they weren't afforded constitutional protections either. So they basically lived in a legal limbo for several years. There were a few Supreme Court cases around this, but there was a key one in 2008 which ruled that they did have the right to challenge their indefinite detention under habeas corpus. And so cases have been proceeding pretty rapidly since then. The vast majority of inmates were actually released fairly early on into their detention during the Bush administration. And by the time Barack Obama came into office in 2009, it was down to 242 detainees.
Yes, although, Elizabeth, I mean, I remember Barack Obama saying then, and it was a long time ago, 2009, that he was going to close it down.
He was going to close it within a year, he said, but Congress didn't like that idea very much and started putting up the barriers, which have basically prevented anybody from trying to close Guantanamo. I mean, Joe Biden was committed to closing it by the end of his term, and that's not happened neither. What happened was in 2011, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which basically put up a whole load of measures that had to be, hurdles first that had to be jumped over before people could be released. So this included things like prohibiting the use of federal funds to transfer detainees to the US soil for any reason whatsoever, or prohibiting them to build detention centres in the US to hold them from using federal funds for it as well. So all of these things basically put the kibosh on Obama trying to fulfill his pledge to the people, which was to close it down within a year.
I mean, it's just an astonishing period of time, isn't it, Harriet? These prisoners have now been held for 20 years without trial. Do you think the US can point to any justification for that?
I think that most people would agree that they can't. Of the 15 people that are still in Guantanamo Bay, 6 of them have never actually been charged with any crime at all. And the other issue is the US has kind of made a rod for its own back in a lot of these cases. A lot of the complications to do with resolving these cases is to do with the fact that a lot of them were tortured in CIA custody, which makes it very difficult to actually create any legal cases that could stand or resolve them down the line.
Because in court, you wouldn't be able to admit that evidence.
Exactly.
And that's when they confess to doing whatever it is they supposedly did.
Supposedly confess to whatever it is they supposedly did or didn't do. So that's created all sorts of complications. It's also like just an astonishing figure that jumped out at me when I was researching this story that I don't think gets talked about actually nearly as much as it should, is just how much Guantanamo Bay actually costs to run. So rights groups calculated that it costs more than $540 million US per year to run it. And with only 15 detainees there now, that's $36 million per person per year. Which is astonishing figure. And 6 of those have never been charged with any crime whatsoever. You know, some people have been there for nearly 20 years. It's absolutely astonishing. Like, I think that we all sort of have kind of memory hold it slightly. We've all kind of put it out of our minds a bit because when Biden took office, there were only 40 people there. So it seemed like a relatively small number when we think about that it at its height held nearly 700 people. So I think that like a lot of people in the UK particularly might have kind of forgotten about Guantanamo Bay and the people that are still there. But the reason it's so big as well in the news this week, not just because of the release of these detainees, but also because the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, so probably the most high-profile person still in Guantanamo Bay, who is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and 2 of his co-defendants, there's this ongoing attempt to arrange a plea deal so that they can plead guilty to 9/11 and avoid facing the death penalty in the US, which actually, that is a plea deal that was kind of, the Defense Department oversaw it, but then they later did a bit of a U-turn on it. And they're trying to block the plea deal at the moment because Congress, which is now controlled by Republicans, want them to face a potential death penalty. So it's really, really complicated this week, particularly. I think that he's due to enter his plea deal on Friday.
And what about these people that are being sent to Oman then? Do we actually know anything about what's going to happen to them?
I think that's what's really interesting, is that we know so little about what's going to happen to them in Oman. Oman is extraordinarily insular, even though it's one of the most stable US allies that there is in the Middle East. It's so insular, it's so secretive. We don't actually really have any details about whatever kind of rehabilitation they will be facing in Oman, apart from what Rebecca said about, I think particularly the arranged marriages idea is quite an interesting one. But we do know that there is a reintegration centre for Guantanamo Bay detainees in Saudi Arabia, which reporters and scholars have been to. And US officials are saying that the Oman programme will be kind of similar, but we don't really have any concrete details.
And then who does that leave in the prison, Rebecca? So you've got these 3 that are facing trial, and then you've got this group that are being sent to Oman, but there are a few others left.
Yeah, so you've got 2 prisoners who have been convicted by a military court, and so they are serving sentences as sort of regular inmates now in Guantanamo. You've got another 7 who have been charged. 5 of them are 9/11 related. And then you've got the 6 that Harriet alluded to who've never been charged with anything. 3 of them have been cleared for transfer because as a result of those sort of legal cases, inmates at Guantanamo do have the right to go before essentially kind of a parole board and try and be cleared for transfer. 3 of those who their countries of origin are not deemed suitable for repatriation. One of them's from Somalia, one's from Libya, and one belongs to the Rohingya Muslims who live in Myanmar but aren't recognised as citizens, so they are stateless. The other 3, I think, are the most interesting. They haven't been charged with crimes, and they probably won't be at this point, but they are still recommended for continued indefinite detention. This category of prisoner, they've been called too dangerous to release, but too difficult to prosecute. And although that sounds very Kafkaesque and hopeless, and obviously is to some extent, it is worth mentioning that dozens of prisoners who did previously have this status have since been recategorised and approved for release on appeal. Those 3 men, however, do come from Afghanistan, Libya, and the Palestinian territories. So even if they do get approved, they probably aren't going anywhere anytime soon.
I mean, the whole thing feels quite dystopian, doesn't it, Elizabeth? And that's not to minimise the feelings of America in 2002, after 9/11, when it was established, and the sense that the world might be against them and they need to do something quickly. And I guess the righteous anger people felt, even towards torture. But we're in 2025 now, and it does seem this strange anomaly to still have this prison not on American soil with American prisoners in it.
That was one of the things that Obama actually argued, was Guantanamo Bay undermined US moral authority. America has always held itself up as being, the leader of the free world, yet here it was regularly using torture, and some of the torture has been horrendous. I was reading there's a thing called walling, where they literally just smashed people's heads against the wall, leaving some with brain damage. And that was in a CIA report that was declassified. They've put people into isolation, held them into stress positions, they've been denied food. I mean, you can't justify torture because of something horrendous that's happened and then hold yourself up and say, we are the leaders of the free world, we are the moral authority, we are the people who should be leading the way for everybody else, when you then carry out so much horrific abuse of people who haven't even been tried. There is no proof that these people are guilty beyond what the CIA or the FBI or whoever have been saying. I found a really nice thing. Fionnuala Ní Aoláin was the first UN rights investigator to be allowed to visit Guantanamo, and she said the use of torture was a betrayal of the rights of the victims of terrorism. And I completely agree with that. Human rights have to belong to everybody, whether we like them or not. And you are taking away everybody's human rights by the way we treat these people in Guantanamo.
And then I suppose that leads us, as much this year inevitably does, Harriet, to what President Trump might do. We know that he's very keen on American security. We know his kinds of views on Muslim immigrants. On the other hand, we know that he likes to say, I solved this. So do you think he could actually close the prison?
I think it's unlikely. It would be an extraordinarily politically unpopular thing to do. It also, bear in mind that it's not just Trump, also his pick for defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, is really categorically against closing Guantanamo Bay. The other thing is that Biden and the Biden administration is trying very, very hard to get as much wrapped up as possible before Trump takes office. And also, as I mentioned, Republicans now control Congress, and they're trying to block this plea deal that would basically at least move along the case against the alleged 9/11 plotters. And the Republican lawmakers have basically promised to introduce this bill that would require those 3 co-defendants in the 9/11 trial to be held in solitary confinement with no possibility of transfer to another country for a death penalty trial that could take potentially years and years and years more. So at the same time as well, I was really interested to read that I didn't realize that Biden is also trying to use some of the detainees as leverage to bring home 3 Americans believed to have been held in Afghanistan since 2022. So he's negotiating with the Taliban as well. And I didn't realize there were still Americans believed to be held in Afghanistan. So I think what's probably most likely is either Biden will get as much of this resolved as possible and Trump will try and take credit for it, or the incoming Trump administration will be kind of posturing on being very, very, very tough on 9/11 co-defendants and trying to get the death penalty for them, even though that will be extraordinarily difficult as well.
In the meantime, then, Rebecca, as we saw in that clip that you chose of Senator Cotton, Republicans are basically saying Biden's letting these guys back to the Middle East without a prisoner exchange. We've got nothing in return for this. That's their argument.
Yeah, and one of their chief arguments for years has been that if you release former Guantanamo inmates, they will go back to their old ways, they will rejoin terror organizations. And I mean, obviously there is going to be some risk of that. And that's one of the reasons that the US has tried to counter that by only releasing them to countries where they can be easily monitored. But worth remembering as well is that the vast majority of them have never had any case proven against them that they were ever members of terrorist groups in the first place. So, talking about them as though they are releasing, hardened, convicted terrorists all around the world to resume their activities against the US is sort of, failing to recognise that the vast majority of them were never charged with any crime in the first place.
OK. Up next, public toilets. Are they going down the pan? That's after this. OK, Elizabeth, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week when we realise we have a wee problem that's getting bigger.
The longer I spend in here, the more my eyebrows singe off.
Welcome back to another episode of an ongoing series where I embark on a journey around the world in search of the ultimate public toilet. And in today's episode, we're on a bus. Yep, we're on a bus in Bangkok.
This is going to be the most interesting one. Oh my God. This is my situation right now. The door keeps flinging open. How is someone meant to sit on that? Look at my toe right now. Please flush after using the toilet. Where's the flush? Most toilets that look like this often come with a do not use sign. There's a hole down there as well. Where does that go to? Your worst nightmare.
TikToker Pack with Jack hunting for the best public toilet in the world on Friday. Elizabeth, it is getting ever harder to spend a penny.
It is getting ever harder to spend a penny, and he could be coming across to Britain very soon. This has been an ongoing problem, but the reason why I'm raising it up is an investigation by the Scottish Lib Dems this week found the number of public toilets in Scotland has fallen by 25% since 2007, which is when the SNP came to power. Now, obviously, the Lib Dems are doing this because they've got Holyrood elections coming up in about 18 months' time, so they're getting a head first in. But this is actually a very serious problem that is affecting the whole of the UK. The British Toilet Association estimates we've lost 50% of public toilets since 2010, so basically when the Tories came to power. The figure was put at 1,782 in 2016, with a population our size. That's not a lot of toilets for people to be able to get to.
And these aren't toilets that are being replaced, are they? Because I suppose the argument with a lot of these sorts of changes in public life is people will say, well, the private sector have stepped in. But that's not the case, is it, with toilets? If you haven't got somewhere to be, there is now nowhere to be.
Some local groups have come in and rescued them, but basically local authorities are cutting back on the amount of loos we have. I mean, some in Scotland no longer have any public toilets. And as Falkirk, where my father-in-law lives, and as a menopausal woman, I am very wary when we go to Falkirk where we can go and where we will find public loos, which is what a lot of people do.
And so what is it when you say that, when you're wary? What's the reality? Like, where do you end up going, actually?
Usually I do what other people do, which is, I find a supermarket, I go to a cafe or a restaurant.
Yeah, so in that sense, the private sector does step in, doesn't it? But
Exactly,
your
yes.
argument is you shouldn't have to go to a McDonald's when you need to go to the loo.
That's it. They're not stepping in as such, because a lot of them will also have signs up saying restrooms, which is this horrible Americanism for toilets. But, restrooms are for customers' use only, so you can't get there. I have become an expert expert of walking into a place and looking as if I'm looking for somebody and, oh, I just accidentally need the toilet while I'm here and my friend isn't around, which is, you know, the ridiculous things you have to do. Or instead of spending a penny, you're spending £3.50 on a coffee just so you can get to the bathroom. You know, they have stepped in as in public sector, but they're not stepping in the way that it should be, where toilets should be free and accessible to everybody. And some people don't like, you know, once you get to women of a certain age, which is past my age, because I don't care about going into pubs by myself, some generations of women will not go into a bar by themselves. So if they're by themselves, they've got no toilet to go to. You know?
Rebecca, how have we got to this situation? Like, why is it that public toilets are one of the first services to be cut when funding is tight?
You know, it all comes down to the way that so many councils across the UK have had to slash their budgets. And the issue is that the maintenance of public toilets isn't a statutory obligation. So it's one of those things that are not necessarily the very first to go, but certainly one of the things that can be cut. You know, there are certain things, social services, children's services, etc., that can't be touched. We've seen it happen in so many ways in public life. The first things to go are things like, you know, beautification and maintenance, planting trees, cutting back verges. I think we've all noticed the way that those sorts of things have fallen by the wayside. Cuts to artistic budgets, to cultural initiatives, that kind of thing. And I think it is contributing towards making people feel pessimistic. You know, it's obviously not what's causing it in itself. There are huge things in motion, you know, around the world with the economy, society, etc., that cause people in the country. You know, we're constantly hearing that people in the UK are feeling more dismayed, more pessimistic about the direction of the country. And I think part of it is that we are living in this no frills world, this bare bones society where the state's only responsibility is literally to keep us alive, without any of the small conveniences that make life easier, especially for people who might have disabilities or, you know, needs where they do need access to a toilet without becoming a paying customer of a business. And I think there is this real normalization of the expectation that when we go into the public sphere now, everything we might need or just want is going to involve a transaction. And that's why we've seen the widespread closure of what we often see referred to as third spaces. So we're talking about libraries, youth clubs. Obviously, public toilets aren't the sort of place you go to hang out, but they are something that we used to have an expectation of, you know, and like bus services, you know, so many things that used to be part of us everyday experience in society, and now they're not. And I do think this does explain so much about like why people feel so bad about the way the UK is going. Because if you think of society as being a club that we all pay into, what do you get for being a member in 2025 compared to what you got in, say, 1995? And I think that does explain a lot of the kind of pessimistic vibe that we've all noticed.
I suppose as well, Harriet, there's a question of the surviving loos that still exist. Are they up to scratch anyway? I mean, I think about the public toilets that I visited in the last year, and often I don't even want to wash my hands in there because it looks like the sink is going to make them dirtier than if I didn't touch it.
Wow, yeah. I live in South London, so the ones that haven't been sold and turned into novelty bars are basically like sort of entering Dante's Inferno. Like you can't imagine the things that I've seen. And actually, as a very small-bladdered woman, I've also become an expert in what is known as London's loo code. So I don't know if anyone's seen this, but a lot of places, like Elizabeth was saying, don't just let non-paying customers come in and use the toilets. You have to go and buy something and get a specific code. There are ways that certain like-minded individuals, women in particular, are sharing these codes online.
What ways? Oh, right. Like voucher codes.
Like accessible codes. Like everyone's sharing like various codes, various places. There's maps for like usable public toilets. It's all things like this because it is actually an accessibility issue. Like particularly with people with any kind of chronic condition or disabilities. Like anyone, for example, with any kind of incontinence or diabetes, or even anyone that's pregnant or needs to use the toilet more often than others. It's a massive accessibility issue. Like the chronic lack of public toilets. So people are basically having to choose between like dehydrating themselves and peeing on the street. It's humiliating, and it's like Rebecca was saying, it's just another way that public life has become so bare bones and so just crushingly depressing, trying to get any kind of access to anything. And just one stat from the Royal Society of Public Health, it's about 43% of people with medical conditions who need to use the toilet more frequently basically feel tied to a really small area around their homes. That is just a terrible thing to think about, that this is such a basic human right. But like the number of toilets maintained by councils dropped 20% between 2015 and 2021 alone.
I just don't really understand this, Elizabeth. I don't understand why in 2025 there isn't a tech solution to this. Like, if the problem is that they can't be funded, then I don't see why people who can afford to spend £1 to go to the toilet can't use their contactless card to get in, and people who are homeless or have a blue badge can be given a card that gives them free access. That doesn't seem like a complicated thing to roll out. Why don't we just do that? I mean, if the issue is just paying for it, why don't we find a way to pay for it?
But what do you do for the people who don't fall into those categories?
I just said you give them free access.
No, but not everybody's going to get free access. What about just say the mother with a child who isn't entitled to a blue badge, or
she has to pay £1. But it's that or not have anywhere to pee. That's the situation we're in, isn't it? And that is what they do I was in Germany on holiday this summer, and every bar and restaurant and service station there gives you access to the toilet, but they often charge you. And what they do is they give you a voucher to spend at the bar. So you get your money back if you are a customer, but if you're not, you pay for it. And then you're paying for the upkeep. And everyone completely accepts that in a very German way, because that's the efficient way they've worked it out.
Yeah, because their economy is going so great.
And I don't think we should have to accept it. You should not be fining people. Like, supposing your child wants to use the loo, are you going to pay £1 just for your child to use the loo? I just don't think that's very fair on the people who fall into that middle gap where they can't afford £1, because for some people that's a lot of money, and they don't have access to get it free. You are going to then, and they are already being hit, you're going to be hitting the vulnerable of society who are already on this low leash, as it's being called, and they won't leave their home unless they can get close to a toilet. And especially if you've got people with children, or people who, pregnant women have to go to the toilet a lot. How much are you going to charge them a day, Ollie? Perhaps you can have season tickets.
It's interesting as well that you mention children, because the truth is, and obviously it's easier with boys than girls, but I have boys, they pee all over the place. Like, they pee in bushes, they pee up against the wheels of cars, because there aren't enough toilets. That's what you do. You don't have a choice, so that's what you do. But people aren't objecting to this in enough numbers, obviously, for anything to change.
I think it's very much like Rebecca said. People have become used to this is how society is, I have seen so many, and it's men who pee up in corners because, women can't. I've tried peeing over a hole in China and it's horrible, Splashback, please, it's awful. Men don't have as much problem as that. But people have become used to seeing this. They've become used to somebody peeing in a corner. They've become used to the fact that there's no toilets around, or they have to do this ridiculous pretense of looking for somebody in the pubs, They have just become used to the fact that society does not work as well as it does 20 years ago, and they accept it.
It's interesting you mentioned as well, Harriet, the toilets that are turned into bars. I actually have on my local high street here in Hertfordshire a cafe that was located in our public toilet, and they spent a lot of money doing it up, and it was a nice cafe, and now the cafe's closed. So not only is there no public toilet, there's also no cafe that replaced it. Do you think there should be a rule that if you take over a former public toilet, you have to provide a toilet in its place?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know. I mean, I was just thinking now of the bar down the road from me in Clapham, the one that they've actually called WC, that now serves it's very expensive wine and cheese, and you definitely can't just be waltzing in there to use the toilet. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I do know that in 2020, I think it was, the government actually granted business rates relief on public toilets, because the argument was that public toilets are a public service, not a business. And I think that kind of, at least the spirit of that should apply if they're taken over. It's difficult to say, though. I mean, already the closure of public toilets is putting a massive strain on local businesses like cafes, like galleries, that can't deal with the strain of all these people coming in to use the toilets. I mean, I think that would be like actually quite a massive hassle, especially if it was like a small local cafe in your case. And we were just talking about as well the gender issue. And I do think this is really interesting that I was reading about actually the first public flushing toilets were unveiled in 1851. But it was 4 more decades before public toilets were built for women as well as men, because it was a really contentious issue. There were all these people that thought that women should be in the home and should absolutely not be allowed to use public toilets anywhere. And it was so contentious that in Camden, in North London, these people intentionally crashed horse-drawn cabs into a site picked out for a women's toilet because they were so outraged by the idea of women using public toilets. So I don't think it's really legit for the argument now to be like, oh, well, women should just be pulling down their pants in public like the men do and peeing in the street like the men do. It's like, well, we've got a lot more kind of safety concerns. There's a lot more issues around that. But yeah, I think it's a hugely contentious issue, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Yeah, Rebecca, you and I have done an episode about that on our history podcast, Today in History with the Retrospectors, and the episode was called The Urinary Leash, and it was about the fact that women for a long time were literally kept at home because they couldn't go out and wee because there was nowhere to go in Victorian society. Do you think maybe that's a way of framing the debate now to make it a slightly sexier topic? I think when it's pensioners talking about lack of toilets, it's hard for people to get behind it on social media. If it was women, we've got a lot of prominent female politicians now saying this is a women's health issue and men are taking away our right to leave the house. Do you think that would have some potency?
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, one thing that stood out to me when I was researching this topic, there was a piece by Francesca Newton in Tribune that was talking about this sort of the way that the debate access to toilets has shifted from being a gendered one at its origin. And she wrote, historically speaking, political anxiety over public toilets has tended to centre on the toilet aspect, the closed cubicles, the exposed bodies, the potential both hold for illicit activity. After 10 years of austerity and a pandemic, though, it's the public part in terms of both access and ownership that's under open threat. And I think that really gets the heart of the issue. You know, it was very much a gendered topic when public toilets first started appearing up and down the country, and it's definitely moved away from that. But I think maybe trying to bring it back towards not just, you know, the effects on women, but the effects on vulnerable groups more generally might be enough to get a bit of action on the topic.
Elizabeth, where do you see this going? You've raised it as your story of the week. Do you see any hope that we might end up with more public toilets, or do you think this is an unstoppable trend downwards?
I think while we have so many men running our local councils and the majority of men in Parliament and in parliaments across the country, toilets will just be seen as, you know, something that can be given away no problem because you can always just go in a corner and pee. We need more women to be shouting out, more women in power to be talking about it and raising their voice in the same way that we have with, you know, period poverty, menopause, all those sort of things. Can I put a quick shout out though to one council that is doing a good job, which is Richmond Council, which is a very posh council, but they are actually working with local businesses for a community toilet scheme. And if we have to work with businesses, this is the way to go. People know that they can go into a local business, whether it's a pub, a restaurant, a shop, without having to buy anything, and they can use the toilet.
So that's like a sticker on the window, is it, that says, come in here and you can have a pee?
They have a community toilet scheme. They have logos, everything. They have 70 across the area. I think it's very noticeable that this is a very well-to-do area, but also an area that's very popular with tourists as well, because obviously it's not just people who live there, it's tourists who come to the country who want it as well. So I would just like to say well done to Richmond.
All right. Up next, what goes in the other end? Is it time to change your dog's dinner? That's after this. Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the butcher's dog still fit?
That is the sound of two dogs eating there. This is why people have turned their back on the legacy media. YouTuber Labradors Kiki and Bonbon scoffing their breakfast on Saturday. Harriet, why?
What? Why are they eating to stay alive?
Why have you brought me this story?
Why have I brought you this story? We are talking about the environmental impact of what your pet dogs are eating.
Right.
And the reason we're talking about it this week is because this scientist has published a paper calculating the true environmental impact of meat-based pet food. Because of this, he's calling for everyone to start feeding their pet dogs a vegan diet. So according to his estimates, if all the dogs were vegan, if all the dogs in the world, which is about 470 million pet dogs, if they were all vegan, it would save 0.6 gigatons of CO2. So that's nearly double the UK's emissions. every year, it would release an area of land larger than Mexico and save enough calories to feed 450 million people. That's more than the whole EU's population.
So say that last bit again. Save enough calories?
About 6 billion animals are killed every year to feed the world's pet dogs, according to his estimates. It's worth noting really quickly that there are a lot of caveats to this study that we can talk about in a minute. But just according to his estimates, if 6 billion animals are killed every year just to feed pet dogs, so if you are starting to feed all of your dogs a vegan diet, then that spares 6 billion land-based food animals that are raised for slaughter and all the associated land that you use for them and all the water that you use to raise them.
But doesn't it take away all the carrots from human consumption? Like, are there enough vegetables to feed all the dogs in the world?
Well, no, because if you think about it, you're feeding the land-based animals that you raise for slaughter vegetables in the first place. It's actually wildly inefficient if you think about it. We use all of this plant-based food to feed all of these animals that we raise for slaughter, and the amount of calories that are lost in that process, it's hugely inefficient. So you actually lose more doing it that way than you would just cutting out the middleman. But that's a different question. But yeah,
I mean, you mentioned caveats. Let's just quickly do the caveats before we discuss this.
Super quick caveats. So there's not actually a lot of research about how pet food affects the planet. And this guy, this scientist, Andrew Knight, he is also a vegan and a professor of animal welfare. He doesn't own a dog. And this study was partly funded by a pet food company called Wild Earth, which sells plant-based pet food. Mm-hmm. And his estimates are only based on one report from 2020 describing the ingredients used by pet food in the US, which has more than 500 ingredients. So caveats to the study, but I think that everyone can agree that the environmental impact of pet food is enormous.
I mean, Rebecca, you're a dog owner. I'm a dog owner. I don't know about you. With respect to Harriet, I do find this discussion a bit tedious because I think it's not a case of should dogs be vegan. Dogs are omnivores, right? My dog does eat our leftover potatoes and pasta and stuff, but also obviously wants some meat as part of a balanced diet. So doesn't everyone give their dog some vegetables anyway?
Yeah, and I mean, fundamentally, yes, dogs are, like humans, omnivores. Yes, they do like meat, but so do humans, and lots of humans subsist perfectly happily as vegetarians or vegans. And you may actually be surprised how close to being a vegan your dog is already. A lot of dog food and dog treats marketed as being, beef, chicken, what have you, contain single-digit percentages of actual animal product. And the vast majority of that is meat byproducts. So it'll be things like bone meal, offal, stuff that isn't commercially viable and is a byproduct of the slaughtering process for meat intended for sale to human consumers. So, it sort of calls into question the idea that 6 billion animals are being slaughtered for the pet industry. I wonder if that's a bit of a generous reading in terms of when talking about animal byproducts. But I took my research, I didn't want to be an anecdata specialist. So I went to allaboutdogfood.co.uk.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you've been experimenting with your dog, feeding it.
Oh, no, although I will say, if we're going to do anecdata, he definitely would happily survive on beans. He loves beans. But allaboutdogfood.co.uk considers any dog food with meat content over 30% to be high meat content, which tells you what the sort of average meat content of dog food is. For instance, bog standard Baker's beef flavour kibble, kind you find in a big bag in the supermarket, only 20% of it is made up of animal derivatives and only 4% is actual beef. A bowl of it is 77% carbs, and I'm not picking on Baker's, that's just an example of typical supermarket kibble. They do a nutritional analysis that has scored several brands of vegan wet and dry food, 50 or more out of 100. 50 is sort of their average score for a sort of acceptable nutritional dog food. In comparison, Baker's only scores 33 out of 100. Lots of really familiar brands only score in the 30s or 40s out of 100. People will say, well, vegans need to take supplements to stay healthy. Well, guess what? Dogs already take supplements. If you look at the ingredients list of any dog food, they are full of supplements. Unless you're following a raw food regime for your pet, their dog food is likely to be full of these artificial additives. And there's a reason for that, which is that they have to meet commercial standards, which means they have to provide a full nutritional diet to the dog. And I think when people, when you see backlash to the idea of vegan dogs, do you know what I think a lot of people are thinking about? Those occasional horrible stories of the children of vegan parents getting sick or even sometimes dying due to malnourishment. I think they're thinking of that. This isn't dogs who are being given bowls of spinach by their owners. This is commercial dog food. It has to meet that same standard. Dogs fed on it will be getting a balanced diet. And although a lot more research is needed, we really don't know like the long-term impact. Nothing that has been done so far has shown that dogs who are fed like a standard, normal, commercially made vegan dog food have any worse outcomes than dogs who are eating meat-based dog food. And some studies have indicated that it might be better, although again, there are caveats around that.
There you go, Elizabeth. No issues. It might be better. Your dog's probably eating a largely vegan diet anyway. Good idea.
I'm with Shirley Valentine on this. If God had wanted vegetarian dogs, he would have made muesli hounds or veggie burger hounds. He made bloodhounds. We have canine teeth like dogs. They have canine teeth because they're supposed to eat meat. And that's what it comes down to. I really do not like the idea of owners imposing their views and their ethics onto their animals. You don't know if this is good for the dog or not. You don't know the long-term consequences. You don't know if it's going to have any health implications.
But what if we did know? What if we did know that a vegan diet was better for dogs? I mean, as Harriet said, to be fair, we don't know that. But there's people hinting that might be the case. If we knew it, then what teeth they have isn't relevant, is it? I mean, you want to give your dog the best diet.
I don't like the idea of mankind deciding what other animals should do. We are supposed to look after them and take care of them, not impose our beliefs on them. If it was better for them and some people wanted to do it, then obviously there would be no argument about it. But at the moment, we don't have that research. And while the research isn't there, I think you can't impose any sort of argument on it being done. That makes
can
no
I
sense
just say,
whatsoever.
We already impose everything on our pets, Elizabeth. These are not wild animals we're talking about. They're not meant to be living in your house, being fed twice a day a bowl of kibble. Nothing about the way that we feed our pet animals at the moment is what happens in the wild. What part of owning a pet dog is natural?
You have never met my cat. I cannot impose anything on her.
Well, cats are actually carnivores, so it's worth noting, I think, that dogs are omnivores, not carnivores. Dogs don't actually need meat. They just need nutrients. So just I think that this is a classic example of a knee-jerk response to this sort of thing. When actually a lot of the studies, like obviously, as we've said, there are not these long-term studies yet. The vegan pet food market is fairly new, even though it is massively booming. But the largest study that we do have to date does indicate some health benefits, because a lot of the problems that you see in pet dogs, health issues, are to do with being overweight. And some of the more high meat content in pet food is generally considered to be the thing that causes more of a weight issue. So I think obviously it's the kind of thing that massively incenses pet owners when they hear it. Although I think what's interesting is about 1% of pet dog owners feed their dog a vegan diet, which I thought was higher than I thought it was.
Well, I suppose it seems to me that might be the most significant thing about this trend, really, for vegan pet food, is that it's really for vegan humans, isn't it, to assuage their fears that they're somehow poisoning their dog by insisting that the dog has I know vegans who feed their dogs meat because they think it would be cruel to insist that their dog has a vegan diet. And I suppose it's good to have some data on whether or not it is.
We do actually have some data. I mean, obviously, there are various studies, and there's been, the biggest one to date was in 2022, and there was another large meta-review in 2024. According to all the data we have, a vegan diet for pet dogs is not unhealthy. It's perfectly safe, and it might even have some health benefits, although it remains to be qualified how much.
And the reason that there's a caveat around that sort of comes back to this idea that most of the dogs that are being given a vegan diet are being given that by vegan owners. I mean, as you can imagine, not many dogs coming to independent, ethical lifestyle choices. But that also then sort of impacts some of the research, because that large study, which was like the largest one that's been done, was based on, because obviously the problem is with, if you do a small study, you can have the dogs looked at by vets. If you do a massive study, you can't have thousands of dogs being followed meticulously by vets. So you have to rely on owner surveys. So obviously the problem there becomes, if you're a vegan, and you probably already have a bit of a chip on your shoulder anyway, and then you're feeding your dog a vegan diet, which attracts an enormous amount of scrutiny and backlash, you probably are subconsciously motivated to be giving in reports to the surveyors that my dog's never been happier, you know, his nose has never been wetter, his coat's never been shinier, I'm doing the right thing, don't criticise me.
And you also probably don't mention the carrion or the fox poo that it ate on the walk home, you know?
Yeah. So, when you're relying on owners, like any survey, self-reported surveys, you can't really take as being strictly scientific. So, longer term studies that actually look at, have vets looking at dogs and giving their analysis over years as well. It'd be interesting to see if there's any impact on older dogs, who've been following a vegan diet for their whole lives, etc. Like whether there is any particular difference in outcome. But I think based on what we've seen so far, it would be really surprising if there was.
If I can do an anecdote, my nephew runs a dog-friendly bar, and I'm telling you, if you were to put down a dog-friendly beer, which is gravy tasting, against half a Coke, they're going to go for the beer every time. They're going to go for the one that tastes like
Yeah, because what dog loves a Coke? Like,
they're not going to do it with a smoothie or anything, Harriet. I'm sorry.
But the point is this, that most dogs are eating a bowl of dusty, dry, reconstituted nuggets that have 1% meat in them. They are not tucking into a juicy steak every night. So it's if you replace those dusty nuggets with vegan ones made using pea protein, would the dog even notice? Put a little handful of nutritional yeast on the top, they wouldn't know the difference.
I think what is interesting is that the thing that has been shown to be unhealthy in dogs is a raw diet, is the raw meat diet that some people do feed their dogs. That has been
Which
shown
is
to
the
be,
most natural thing. I mean, that is what they're designed to eat, raw vegetables and raw meat.
Theoretically, the most natural thing. Actually, that's the thing that's been shown to be actually have some real health drawbacks. So that's the one to be avoided.
But this whole thing comes about because people are saying it's more environmentally conscious, Harriet. That was how you started this story.
Yeah.
You're worried about the planet. Should you be thinking about vegan dog food? There is a debate around that, which is, this is so not the most important thing to change. Do you know what I mean? Private jets, drilling for oil.
Yeah, of course.
That's a bit more important than what my dog eats.
Well, actually, I get the tendency to whataboutery there. I totally do. But the livestock industry produces about a quarter of all human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. That is an extraordinary amount. That's far more than private jets. So that's the livestock industry. I get that the knee-jerk thing would be it's not the most important thing, but actually, it really is one of the most important things. And of that industry, actually not insubstantial amount of it is going to pets. The estimate is roughly 8% of all the land animals that we eat is going to pets. That's not nothing. So if there's anything that can put a dent in that, then I think it's worth thinking about.
And as Rebecca mentioned earlier, all pet food has to be safe for human consumption in this country. I'm just curious. Have any of you ever tried pet food?
Almost.
By accident?
Well, you go out for a drink, you come home, you're feeding the cat, and you think, I wonder what it really tastes like.
So your late night kebab was a tin of Whiskers.
The spoonful of Whiskers got about halfway to my nose, and I realised I wasn't that drunk. So yes, it went back.
So I've accidentally tried some of my bird seed once, but that was completely the seed was right next to the other seeds.
Seeds are seeds.
Seeds are seeds, whatever, fine. But that was a complete accident.
Rebecca, you've obviously sniffed the kibble.
It gets on my hands pretty much every day, to be honest, but I do wash my hands. Although I was tempted the other day, our dog got a set of Christmas-themed biscuits from my grandma as a Christmas present.
Just
and
curious.
they smelled really good, I have to say. They smelled like fresh-baked cookies. It was really tempting.
Do you guys remember the kind of fake chocolate drops that used to be given to pet dogs? The ones that looked just like chocolate drops? I gave some to my little sister once when she was a kid and told her they were chocolate.
You're all evil. My thanks to Rebecca, Harriet, and Elizabeth. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you find your podcasts, and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine, vegans included, with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann, Omnivore. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.